So, I am honored. Good afternoon again, and thank you everybody for joining us. And this is a joyous occasion. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Katrina vanden Heuvel. Thank you, Kat. We have known one another for many years, thanks to our first meeting long ago here in Princeton when my dear friend, your late husband, Professor Stephen Cohen, introduced us. And we have visited together in many arenas, Katrina and I, over these many years. We've met on issues being addressed today, but also in the arts and human rights. Katrina's star has risen steadily and shines brightly as a life of excellence in understanding and reporting political realities. Katrina vanden Heuvel is editorial director and publisher of The Nation. She served as editor of the magazine from 1995 to 2019. She currently writes a weekly column for The Washington Post and is a commentator on U.S. and international politics for MSNBC, CNN, PBS. She is the author of The Change I Believe in, Fighting for Progress in the Age of Obama, and co-author with Stephen Cohen of Voices of Glasnost, Interviews with Gorbachev's Reformers. She has been recognized for her journalism and public service by many progressive organizations. During her tenure, The Nation's journalism has been recognized for excellence by the National Magazine Awards, the Society of Professional Journalists, the Maggie Awards, GLAAD, the National Association of Black Journalists, among others. In addition to the Quincy Institute, she also serves on the boards of Progressive Caucus Center, the Institute for Policy Studies, the Roosevelt Institute, Four Freedoms Park Conservancy, the Sidney Hillman Media Foundation, Inequality Media, the Osborne Association, and Research to Prevent Blindness. Many things. She is president of the American Committee for U.S.-Russian Accord, ACURA. Among these accolades and awards, Katrina vanden Heuvel received the 2023 Marcus Raskin Award for Civic and Intellectual Courage from the Institute for Policy Studies. I bring this up because the award is named for IPS co-founder Mark Raskin and was jointly presented to her by IPS and the Raskin family, recognizing an outstanding and brave leader in fields of peace, social reconstruction, art, and politics. Katrina, you are all these and more. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please welcome Katrina vanden Heuvel.
Thank you. May I say I'm belling because I'm with you? No. It's really been wonderful to have a chance to meet you, many of you, in the reception. I don't believe in horoscopes unless I believe in them, and my Washington Post horoscope this morning said, steer clear of talks about politics and international relations. So I was going to turn around, but Irene and Reverend Moore had persuaded me. I take hope from what I've heard today. It's hard to do that in these times because I've been in the news profession for some 40 years, and I've never seen anything like this. And it's more than news. It's heartbreaking. The Nation was founded in 1865, July, and its first line. And one of its founders was Frederick Law Olmsted, by the way, who was going to stay, but then he decided he was interested in parks. But the line was, "The week has been singularly barren of exciting events." The least buzzy line you could start a magazine with. But more seriously, the unthinkable is becoming thinkable. The war in Ukraine, among other things, has reached a point of grave danger. Irene mentioned Steve, who taught here for 30 years and was a mentor to many students. His mentor was Robert C. Tucker, who, by the way, served in the U.S. Embassy in the 50s, and he stayed for longer than he anticipated because He met his wife, Zhenya, who came to teach here. But Bob was an assistant to George Kennan, and they replicated their relationship here. So Kennan was 90, Bob was 70, but Bob was still the young disciple who listened to George Kennan, who I'm so glad opened this extraordinary organization. But Steve's last book, a collection of columns, was called War with Russia, ? And he never brought himself to remove the question mark. He passed away before the horrible aggression of February 2022. Let me talk briefly, if I could, this afternoon about several intersecting threads which I believe have brought us to this moment, and the forces and events which might have averted the crisis. I'm not interested in counterfactual, but I do think sometimes there's an inevitability to our thought that we're here because we're here, as opposed to decisions that could have been made and that might be made moving forward to have at least a somewhat more peaceful world. I worry sometimes. Someone in coming into the room today said, "I'm a peacemaker." I said, yes, but peace has become a subversive term too often in our media, as if it's not valued. But what could resolve or come near in a very concrete way to a negotiated settlement, for a ceasefire settlement in Ukraine, versus the possibility of really a third global war? And let me engage the proverbial question, what is to be done? Just to short circuit that in 5 words, this is what cannot work in my view. There is no military resolution. Negotiation and dialogue are the only viable solution to the crisis. Let me start with someone Steve and I came to greatly admire, Gorbachev, Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, who came to power. It was a short reign from 85 to 1991. What we can learn, I wrote a column for the Washington Post last year about what we can learn regarding security, true security, from Gorbachev. What is so tragic is that at the end of the Cold War, and I'm not sure what we are in today, but I date the end of the Cold War 91, or when the Soviet Union ended in 1991, there were real alternatives on offer regarding a new security framework. I offer 3 lessons that Gorbachev provided. Militarization does not make us safer. Security starts with cooperation, and a reminder that one of the best ways to enhance security, safeguard our national security, is to preserve and advance our democratic institutions. I have always believed that understanding this new security reality is not idealism. It's not isolationism. It is realism. I suggest you find, though many of you in this room may have read it, or a shortened version of it, Gorbachev's December 7th, 1988 speech to the UN. It's one of the great documents. He astonished the global community when he announced drastic cuts in the Soviet military presence in Eastern Europe, a move that ultimately allowed Soviet satellites to choose their own paths. He laid out a new world order, one based, as he said, on the demilitarization of international relations, changing from an economy of armament to an economy of disarmament. He was not naive. After all, he emerged from the Soviet power system. He'd been, the regional boss of this Krasnoyarsk Oblast. But here was the most radical and committed arms reductionist ever to lead a nuclear country. In Reykjavik in 1986, there was talk, and the leaders' aides were horrified. They were glad they were in a room for a short while because it seemed that Nancy Reagan had not traveled with Ronald, and he had promised her he would spend very few nights away. I don't think if there had been 2 days. But there was an obsession, but rightly so, with SDI at that time. And Reagan believed in it. I think he'd seen a few movies. And Gorbachev thought it would be a new arms race. But in any case, that he transformed the idea into real alternatives to escape the Cold War. He understood, as you do here, if we don't attempt what seems impossible, we risk facing the unthinkable. And that's what he spoke of when he seized on the idea of nuclear abolitionism. But at the end of the Cold War, Gorbachev also spoke of something relevant today. it doesn't seem reachable, but he spoke of a common European home, stretching from Lisbon to Vladivostok, not a militarized zone with NATO dominant. So that's where NATO expansion, which I'm sure many of you have followed in your lives and in the history books and in the material today. It wasn't that it was simply moving eastward. Much has been written and archival material unearthed showing us the broken promise to Russia, that if Germany reunified, NATO wouldn't move 1 inch eastward. There's a very good book by Marie Serrault called Not 1 Inch Eastward, pushing all the way to the Russian border. It's also Jack Matlock, who is really remarkable in his early 90s. I sometimes think, why is it, but I understand why, the most wise these days seem to be 90. No, I mean, seriously, I mean, you may disagree with Chaz Freeman, but Jack Matlock is on fire. He can't believe, anyway. But, he believes, and I think he's right, the triumphalism at the end of the Cold War. No one won. The Cold War ended largely through negotiation in Malta in 1989, for example. But the end of the Soviet Union encouraged Americans, and the government primarily, the establishment, to think that history itself had validated American virtues and given the United States a new mandate to improve the world, but not by providing it with a model, like your wonderful program on guns and safety. Why are kids being killed in DC, sitting in cars, right? I mean, we should become a model for the world, and not necessarily a policeman. And I think the triumphalism that we are number one, the indispensable nation, the leader of the free world, okay, that's, we love our country, but we aspire. We're not there yet. So at the end of this Soviet Union, and by the way, it's hard to believe, I'm happy to talk afterwards, but the Soviet Union was abolished. 3 guys went into a forest, Bielovesh forest, Kravchuk of Ukraine, Yeltsin of Russia, and I forget the Belarus leader, and signed a treaty. It was over. NATO was an institution in search of a mission, a purpose. It had been designed essentially to keep Germany down, Russia out, and America in, but it had been designed in a sense to counter the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw Pact was over. I'm so out of it that a friend of mine said a few years ago he was going to San Diego to the Comic-Con meeting. If you remember the Economic Institution, which was, I said, Comic-Con, wait a minute, that dissolved along with the Warsaw Pact. He said, Katrina, get with it, the Comic-Con, the Star Wars, and the video. It's worth remembering, by the way. I used to say it was no tea party. NATO, you can't do that anymore. It was no coffee klatch. It's the largest lobby for NATO expansion. Who do you think the largest lobby was? Arms makers. And there's a big arms fair in Paris next week, and the arms race goes on in that way too, the sales. But let me take you back, if I might. History may not justify, but I think it informs. Today, if you say you think NATO might be better served, you're called a Trumpian, essentially, which is scrambled politics. But George Kennan was one of the leading opponents. Another Princetonian, Bill Bradley, Gary Hart, Ben and Sherry's, and establishment figures. Tom Friedman. It's worth remembering Kennan's prophetic words of February 1997 in an interview with Tom Friedman. Quote, expanding NATO would be the most fateful era of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. But he went on, such a decision may be expected to inflame the nationalistic, anti-Western, and militaristic tendencies in Russia, to have an adverse effect on the development of Russian democracy, to restore the atmosphere of the Cold War to East-West relations, and to impel Russian foreign policy directions decidedly not to our liking. And last but not least, he said, make it much more difficult to achieve further reductions of nuclear weaponry. 1997, someone who had studied, grew up with the country's history, politics, and culture. I wanted to come back to what Bob said. We see the not so slow and dangerous dismantling of a generation of arms control treaties. At their first summit in 1985, and Steve and I were there with Cora Weiss, Jesse Jackson, there were a lot of people. It was a famous photograph where Reagan and Gorbachev looked at their watches, like where. And Steve and I came to know Gorbachev quite well after he left power. And in his foundation offices, it was always kind of vertiginous for me because it was an extraordinary time in Moscow. We lived there off and on from 85 to 92. We couldn't get a visa individually or together from 81, 82, 83, 84 because Steve was smuggling books like John Locke and the Kama Sutra, which the Russians published with no pictures. Which, his office, Gorbachev's office, had big pictures of Reagan on a horse and like Reagan with Thatcher. Okay. But Reagan, to his credit, pushed away those who were deeply opposed to any better relationship with then the Soviet Union. Al Haig, as late as 1987, I'm sure some of you remember, called Gorbachev Stalin in Gucci shoes. And the fact that he came from the Communist Party, as I said, if you have one party, think of it, and we have this problem in our country. We have two parties, we're not as poor. But if you have one party, you're going to have many factions and coalitions. And out of that Communist Party, after the end of the Soviet Union, you had essentially Gorbachev was a social democrat. And then you had hardline communists who today, you walk into Zyuganov's office, head of the Communist Party in the Duma, and he has an icon, picture of Stalin, and World War II, regalia. So, but back to the issue at hand, the arms control treaties. Both leaders pledged in 1985, a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. Now, Biden and Putin reiterated this at their one gathering, but it is not being applied, the mindset. What is deeply alarming in both the media today and our leadership, not all of it, but is the loose talk, even the normalization of nuclear dangers, risks. Just the other day, I think today, there's Putin out of the St. Petersburg Economic Conference talking about, tactical nuclear weapons, battlefield nuclear weapons. And not just Putin, which is very dangerous, but a lot of commentators in Russia, but in this country too. And China we don't even factor in because there will be growth there from a lower base. But think about this. The accidental also looms. My colleague, my good friend from Princeton, Eric Schlosser, wrote a very good book called Command and Control about the accidents that could happen, have happened. Nuclear reactors, 2 weeks ago, Ukrainian drones struck a radar facility inside Russia that gives early warning of incoming ballistic missiles. The New York Times had the presence of mind the other day to retrieve history and reported this appears to mark the first time that an American president, has allowed limited military responses on artillery missile bases and command centers inside borders of a nuclear-armed country. And furthermore, the New York Times reported, in President Biden's advisors concede that American and Ukrainian priorities are diverging. At this point, Ukraine has nothing left to lose. I mean, that's what, from escalating with Russia. Biden still does. And we're likely to see more divergence. U.S. has already chastised Ukraine for bombing Russian oil refineries because it's increasing the price. The problem, the Ukraine, many progressives, you want to support Ukraine, but at the same time, at this point, Ukraine could not join NATO. It has not met the steps. But there is a view, Ukraine is autonomous, it has agency. But until this is resolved politically, again, I come back to the military resolution, it's not possible to increase Ukraine's democracy without a secure, negotiated framework. And there will be there is a view that the longer you arm Ukraine, the stronger it will be at the negotiating table. But, you know, is that going to be another winter? Mr. Frost, Mr. Mud? We've already witnessed a dangerous mission creep. I don't know if you followed this, but, you know, many months ago, Biden said no to sending an advanced missile, and then said yes. Then he said no to the latest tank, and then he said yes, no to F-16 fighter planes. It goes, every red line has been crossed, and along the way he opposed any soldiers from NATO going to Ukraine. And now he's starting to relent. French military advisors are on their way. Will U.S. advisors be on the way? Door is opening to such steps. And then one terrible thing, and this is a big, different conversation, the military-industrial complex, which is no longer just the military-industrial complex. Someone here knows Ray McGovern, who's a character. But he did come up with Mickey Mat, like military-industrial congressional media. Look it up. But it's more than just the military-industrial complex. But on the other hand, President Biden is telling us that we're creating more jobs by building arms. And 80% of that money that just passed in the Congress appears to be going here to make weapons. Now, one could argue that we've been living with a kind of military Keynesianism for decades, but this is just imprinting it on the soul and the economic structure in a way that is, I think our paramount work is to find a new security infrastructure that is about transitioning people to different jobs which are more productive. This goes back, catch history. Who remembers Seymour Melman? Oh my God. I have a friend named Bill Hartung, who's very smart about it, who writes for The Nation and other. But we've talked about a new conversion program. Because there's a reason that our good representatives, that the caucus trying to find new jobs and close down plants has such a hard time, because if you vote against a plant in your district, you're voting against jobs. So it has to be reframed. And there are good people in Congress, and I think your voter's guide is critical. And you have to support them where they are, but it's a tough uproad. Blair, you remember Bruce Blair? Bruce Blair was terrific about this, because he had been in the nuclear service, so to speak. The good news is in some parts, like in Montana, where the ICBMs are built, they're local kind of protest, because you have to engage those who are working on this. I don't want to sound like Hillary Clinton, but remember the deplorables? But she went on to say we have to create good jobs in those communities. The problem is, that's another talk, the trust in government is not at an all-time high. All right, let me come back. So there's a key, I think, so Putin's been in power too long. You know, I'm not sure what he is, a dictator, authoritarian, autocrat. There's a lot of political science that goes into that. But remember how he was selected? And the first act in power? And he was selected by the oligarchs. And his first act in power was to give immunity to Yeltsin and his family. He was selected. In the Russian literature, in the books, you find people, well, Stepashin's not going to do it. There's this guy in St. Petersburg who was helpful in getting rid of the corrupt mayor. So there was a reason, and he comes in, and Wall Street Journal and the New York Times say he's a guy we can do business with. Sounds like Margaret Thatcher. The Nation wrote that he looks like he's an authoritarian type. So he's there, and the shooting of let me just say, how you think about the 90s in Russia affects our thinking today, because Yeltsin was treated like Abraham Lincoln by Clinton. The de-democratization of Russia didn't begin under Putin, it began under Yeltsin. The shelling of an elected parliament in 2003, the oligarchical looting of a country, the impoverishment, far more than the Great Depression of this country. So Putin comes in, Chechnya, other wars, and I think what's keeping, and now I come more toward the present, what's keeping a revival of a kind of peace movement, Annie Nuke, has been the belief on the part of many, not just young people, that when the Soviet Union ended, the threat was over. Didn't need to pay any attention, when in fact maybe Frank von Hippel thinks, it was more dangerous in some ways. So there's not energy. There was a march, I was there, and you were there, 1 million people in Central Park, June 12th, 1982. That played a role. That's a sign of, from below to the top, an entire category of weapons, the INF Treaty, reduced category of weapons. And I think that was critical. What we've seen since then is really the rollback of very difficult, they've been worked on, organized treaties. I think the most dangerous one was in 2002, the beginning, the fundamental ABM treaty, which John Bolton led the way to reverse and end. And then you had, the conventional armed forces in Europe and suspended now we have hanging by a thread the New START Treaty. And that's going to be very difficult to put back this infrastructure of arms control. Maybe Frank von Hippel disagrees, but I think technocracy, the technocratic fixes, are not going to carry it. You need to have some political dialogue in order to rebuild. And this dismantling happens at the worst possible time because, as far as I know, with the exception of the Arctic, where there's a little bit of scientific collaboration, all collaboration, down to the ag department, has been suspended. Now, maybe they're back channels, but if you don't have dialogue, what do you have instead? You have the resort to military action more easily done. I think it was very important that ICANN received the Nobel Peace Prize. I think what's happening at the much reviled UN is important at the General Assembly on the treaty to abolish weapons. The signatures continue, not the nuclear powers. But I think unless there's real commitment, it's going to be in a change in relationship. We are seeing a Russia, by the way, allied more with China. And there too you see an increase in the arms race because China feels it's not been playing. I want to speak briefly about the media. So Steve used to call it media malpractice, the coverage of US-Russian relations, Russia. I don't know where to begin, but I will begin with Reverend Moore's very good column on Oppenheimer, because you were head of mobilization, and it was, they used to call it red-baited, but a generation thinks of red as like Dale Earnhardt and NASCAR. Because there was a famous Time magazine cover, do you remember, in 2004? Which side are you on, red or blue? And if you didn't know Dale Earnhardt and NASCAR, you were not, anyway. But the toxicity of the vilification of dissenting voices and the association of dissenting voices with foreign countries, often hostile foreign countries, is something we've seen for many years. I did my work at Princeton on the McCarthy years. Not Eugene, but Joe McCarthy and the 40s, 50s, and it's a toxicity that is in our system that at times of stress, of war, dissent is often treated as a dangerous force. It leads to the silencing of alternative views and the degradation of our media culture. This country deserves a robust debate. We think of the marketplace ideas. Now, social media, the hatred, the polarization, the vitriol has made it tougher to defend. But we are witnessing the demonization, even criminalization of diplomacy. And the idea of diplomacy and restraint, as opposed to posturing and warlike talk, a belief in military restraint and diplomatic engagement and cooperation with other nations, it's a very dangerous time. And so much of the media encourages us to be passive. I love being here because there's a citizen awareness activism. And by the way, do you know about Bill McKibben's group? the codgers, not to be, you are, a lot of young people aren't going to vote, but I think he's right about it. Too many in the media don't speak truth to power. They become stenographers to power. And I think Iraq, for many, again, it's now an older generation. It's hard to believe. But Iraq was a time when there was vilification of dissent. And I think it's very dangerous. How we break this up, I think I was talking earlier about organizing, activism, documentaries. Have any of you seen TV Event? I'm going to send a link. It's about the making of The Day After. And The Day After is an interesting example of popular culture having a political effect because it influenced Reagan to a certain extent and it led to 1 million people. Other factors, Randy Forsberg and Randy Keeler and the Freeze. How do we develop clear, simple, mobilizable, action-oriented steps that could be around the country? How could it build into the peace education voter? I think questionnaires are often transactional, but there has to be a countervailing force to the military-industrial complex from those who seek peace, because I don't think Americans, I never like to speak for Americans, but they're not seeking endless war. There's something else, and there was a poll just the other day that people don't want a wartime leader. And, you know, Biden, I agree with everything you said. Check out the last issue of The Nation, which has a special issue on Project 2025, which is the Heritage Foundation's kind of replay of the 1976 Mandate for Leadership, which Reagan governed by. The policies on every issue, including Israel-Palestine, China, Russia, are worse than what we see with Biden. But someday I want a president I really endorse. And I'll say two last things. We endorsed Bernie Sanders in 2016. The sadness is that, you know, he has a great reform program, but progressives are still, we need a kind of new foreign policy. And you cannot separate, it seems to me, domestic from foreign policy. It's working, but it's not working. And then I want to say that when Bill Bradley ran for president, do you remember? It was 2000. Steve was put together a foreign policy team. And Steve was also invited to Camp David in 1989 to debate Richard Pipes. I don't know if you remember. So Steve says to me, it's too early, because he'd go to bed really. I said, I think you're going to Camp David. And he won that debate. But Bradley had Steve as his foreign policy advisor. So Steve would do surrogate debates, and he debated Biden on NATO. Could be different. But I wanted to end by just saying, you know, there are no lost causes. There are only causes waiting to happen and to be won. And I know this is a really grim time, but if we don't stay engaged, it's not going to get better. And I feel a resilience in this room because you're engaged. I think the worst thing is to have no purpose. And I think our purpose is to make this a more peaceful, just world. Thank you. Thank you.
There's going to be some questions.
So I wrote Reverend Moore and I said, can I talk for 15 and take questions? And he said, well, you may get a lot of comments, which is anti-democratic.
Right. Well, Bob will lead us through this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katrina. And I'm going to ask one of our volunteers could come forward to carry around the microphone. We're going to have Q&A period. I thought that was a really thoughtful, deep presentation with a lot of challenging ideas in it. And I think we need more of that. No, this one. Take this one. So I'll tell you who to take it to. I'm going to call on people, so don't take it yet. Don't take it yet. Just be ready. So now we're up to question answer period, and Katrina had also pushed for some conversation, but I'm going to say brief comment, 30 seconds or less. So we're not here to hear other speeches, but if you have a question or a short comment that you'd like to make, please raise your hand and I'm going to number you off. And then we'll...
At least you're not doing debate style where
Yeah.
you close off the mic.
Yeah. 1, Catherine. 2. Any more? Okay. All the way in the back. Kip. 3, 4, Dozier. There must be others who have comments or questions. 5, Peter. Anyone else? Well, let me just give it one more second before we take the first comment or question. Katrina mentioned the 1982 demonstration, and I just wanted to build on that because I was the one who called together the broad coalition that sponsored that rally. And I was working still at the national level of the anti-nuclear movement at that time. Subsequently, before the march actually happened, I came here to be the leader of this group. So I was involved up to my eyeballs. And as a result, the FBI got ordered to watch me. And so I started to be called a communist. So this is real. This was 1981 and 82. Reader's Digest came out, and I was called a communist in it. And I had clergy friends calling me up, Bob, this is panic time. They just called you a communist. And I said, yeah, they called Martin Luther King a communist too, didn't they? Nothing so bad about that, but it is. It suppresses our democracy when people vilify that way and name call that way. So I think it is important for us to not tolerate that kind of behavior and to push back on it. So Catherine, I think you were the first one with a comment or question, and go ahead and take the mic to her now. Thank you, Samara.
I was struck as I listened to the coverage of the D-Day ceremonies this week, how we patted ourselves on the back for what we had done. We patted the Allies on the back. But those who studied World War II know that the Russians carried the heaviest burden. And I could picture myself sitting in the Kremlin listening to the D-Day ceremony saying, who's going to talk about us and what we did? And that made me think about what you said. How do we restart dialogue at a human level? How do we, during the Yeltsin times, the US government sponsored a lot of people going over, I was one of them, to work at a person-to-person level with Russians. Very positive interactions, very hopeful. You know, they live, die, and love just the way we do. And the question is how can we start doing more of that and creating those kinds of opportunities for person-to-person dialogue?
It's such an important question. It's such an important question. First of all, on World War II, I mean, you could have had a situation where 2 or 3 veterans from Russia were invited. The Russians were not invited. And we used to get World War II museum material signed by Tom Hanks and Steve Spielberg. And because Steve's uncle had fought in the war, we made a contribution. And the language was literally like the Red Army loped by. There's no sense of 27 million, every family. So there's no way that, though Putin to a certain extent has, quote, weaponized World War II in this battle with Ukraine, there's still a recognition, and there should be. Roosevelt would be spinning in his grave. I am involved with the Roosevelt Institute in New York, and they still have photographs of Churchill, Stalin, Roosevelt. I'm waiting for that to be someday called to cancel, which I hope not. Citizen diplomacy, I think, is an undervalued, important tool. I was involved with a citizen diplomacy meeting about a year ago in California. I'm meeting on Wednesday with a woman who met her husband, has lived in Siberia, an American woman for years, because she was involved with you. Remember Samantha? That was ages, in '83. But I do think beginning for a call to restart professional citizen diplomacy. Bill Bradley, when he was in the Senate, had a wonderful student exchange program. Those kinds of things should be revived. And I think as a beginning, as I mentioned, the Arctic, there's a lovely American guy named Pavel Devyatkin. They have some scientific experiments. Go back to Pugwash. You know, I mean, really, the scientific exchanges, I think that's the way to begin. And even with scientific exchanges, there could begin an arms control level to it. That's the best way at this moment. The State Department just brought in, to replace Victoria Nuland, the former ambassador to NATO. I'm not expecting a lot of new thinking from NATO, so we need to find other channels. And I do think the exchanges are important.
Another thing we might do is also restore the American libraries around the world. The USIA, the USIS had these fabulous libraries. And there's another opportunity for that kind of citizen-to-citizen
Absolutely.
dialogue.
There's so many layers and levels. The ecology, you know, I mean, science, climate, and it doesn't need to be just Russia. It could be tripartite, you know, but to bring Russia back in, and there are obstacles there, but and media. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just pass it right down the line there to my daughter, Dorothy.
Ah.
Going to have the next question or comment.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. That was fascinating. I feel like I could just sit and listen.
Come home with me. My daughter doesn't like to listen.
But what you said about having collaboration, having so little overlap, and we were just talking about citizens and governments working together, and having such an easy way to go right to war when you don't have those ties. But there's a lot of fear because working with, like you say, oh, you're working with the Russians on that. So on one hand, using like non-military related work as a sort of pressure to say, we're not going to work with you if you behave like this. And on the other hand, saying, we're not working with them, of course they can't, have good conversations with us. So where do we find that middle ground of when is it okay to say, we're using this as to take a stand, we're not going to work with you as long as you behave this way?
So I think the tool of sanctions we've over-sanctioned not just Russia but many countries, and I think often it doesn't work because it affects people, not the leadership in question. I think one of the underreported characters in this horrific mess is this state central banker in Moscow, who's kind of run an economy that hasn't imploded as many thought. But I think the ability again to begin citizen-citizen diplomacy at a level that's about humanizing, not privileging, is important. There is a wild demonization of Russia, not just of Putin, but of Russia. Think of all the concerts canceled, the panels canceled. That should be an exchange point, like pen or culture, because people are caught in that, not the governments. So, there's still stuff going. I mean, Steve and I supported a small publishing group in Russia that publishes the first monographs of young historians. Mm-hmm. And we continue to do that. Of course, someone who was very close to us, the publisher and editor of Novaya Gazeta, who won the Peace Prize 2 years ago, whose journalists have been killed, he is now a foreign agent, but he's involved with a case defending Memorial. To put a larger picture around this, I think in times of war, the worst forces come to power, rise to the surface, the nationalist hatred. Good people get caught up, dissenting voices get caught up. So I think we haven't talked much about this, but the first thing is a ceasefire to really, and there are Russians supporting it publicly. There's a man named Grigory Yavlinsky, who was on a webinar with me and 2 other people organized by Cynthia Lazaroff, who's a very good civil diplomacy person. If you look up her group, Nuclear Weapons, Women Fighting Nuclear Weapons. So there are little steps, but little steps are better than no steps and regressive steps. And business communities, the Rotary used to do a lot of work exchanging small business groups. There are all kinds of things that shouldn't threaten, but would possibly open up.
So is there no...
But let me just say one thing about the media. There's an article that's going to make the New York Times or the Post in the next few days about a group which has received a lot of funding for disinformation work. And it's put out a list of enemies who are involved with Russia-related things, like John Mearsheimer, Anatol Levin, Cy Hirsch. Then you get to Gray Zone, and then you get to The Nation. You get to me, I'm honored, Chomsky. But these are people who've had some material published in Russia or ties to Russia, and it is essentially a kind of enemies list. And it's no longer communism. It's Russia stooge, Putin puppet, and it really debilitates. It cuts you off at the knees because there is this list circulating.
So sanctions
We can't
don't...
take a second part to the question. So, Samara, can you come and get that? David, you'll be number 6. 7, Alan. Kip, there is next, all the way in the back on the left.
Hi, thank you very much. I just wanted to ask a little bit more about your organization, Acura.
Yeah.
Bill Bradley, I believe, is on the board, which is a favorite guy in these parts. And I wanted to know how you all are keeping the door open on the New START treaty. It's in a quagmire. And I'm just wondering, how you are able to keep the conversation going at this stage.
Well, Acura is really designed to keep open the idea of dialogue and restraint and engagement with range of articles. We've done webinars. It's public education. I think what's needed is a more activist group. This is not it, but we have good people like Jack Matlock and Bill Bradley, and then activists like Cynthia Lazaroff. Anatol Levin is a scholar. We do a lot of work with Quincy, which I know you know about because Trita Parsi founded it 5 years ago. And Anatol did just take a trip to Moscow, where he had some off-the-record discussions with Russian scholars, nuclear scholars, but not scientists. All of that is good. And I think Quincy's a good force, if I could just digress to that for a minute, because there's nothing else like it in Washington. The think tanks are essentially way stations for people waiting to get back into government, and there's not a lot of thinking going on in the think tanks. And when people agree too much, it's not going to change the world in its first years, but the idea of war is the very, very last resort, as peace is not a subversive term of restraint and dialogue. And it's very much in the American tradition. And when Biden or others call it isolationist, it's an effort to kind of kneecap it, because it's not isolationist. It's interested in treaties, climate, and other. But I think that's an important group for people. And by the way, there's Quincy Student Network, which is hopeful. And I spoke to 2 of the groups. I was kind of surprised because the woman who ran the webinar didn't look like John Mearsheimer. She had pink hair, but that was good.
Okay, I think we're up to questioner number 4. Was that? Yeah, Dozier. And then when you're done, Dozier, you're going to pass it down to your right for Peter.
I just want to comment first that both Biden and Blinken have said repeatedly, I first think I heard Blinken talk about, isn't it great we're getting all these jobs, we're getting all this business for America through arms. And to me, that was, I'll just be blunt, criminal to say that it's great that we're getting jobs by killing people and selling weapons. And we all know it's a huge business in the United States. But in terms of Ukraine, I wish you could talk, which connected that obviously, about where you think we should be doing what we should be doing. What would be a good wind down of the war? You mentioned ceasefire already, but if you could expand on that, that'd be great. Thank you.
So, as you may know, there have been several attempts at negotiations, going back to the Minsk Accord, the Minsk II. There's a peace conference in Lausanne, I think, or Zurich next weekend. It's one that the Russians weren't invited to. There's something on offer from Istanbul. Putin the other day gave an interview to Reuters where he spoke of a peace deal, that they're open to it. The details, this is painful, but probably if there was a way to organize 15 to 20% of the Donbass, those 4 areas which are Russian-speaking and that are kind of already occupied. A Foreign Affairs article had a reporting piece about the passports and the language and the facts on the ground, which is a term I hate. But Ukraine has to have a security agreement. It has to be, its land must be protected. There's no craziness about going to Kiev. I do think that Putin is put in the framework of history in a wrong way. He has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the great geopolitical mistakes. He's also said a few weeks later after that anyone who wants the reconstruction of the Soviet Union has no brain, but a heart, kind of like there's nostalgia, but it's not. And he has enough economic problems, which he talks about a lot, but we don't pay attention to, that the idea of taking on pensions in the Baltics, there's an idea that he's expansionist. As Biden said the other day, if we don't stop him, he's going to take over Europe. That's a very powerful narrative. It hasn't been tested. I don't think this is 1938, 1939. But there are plans. There are a lot of plans. But what there hasn't been is initiative or the will. And there is a belief. You're not going to find a lot more money, though the U.S. is trying to through EU agreements. But at the end of the day, will Ukraine be more powerful at the negotiating table? But there's a denialism that occasionally seeps into media of this may be the last, and what then? We're paying the pensions in Ukraine. We're paying, I think, 1/3 of the GDP. The country's 1/3 of the size because people have fled. The draft age is now up to 62. There's a demographic crisis, and there's fear of mobilization, both in Ukraine and Russia. Putin's using a lot of money to suppress the resistance. You don't see it much because it's not in Moscow, St. Petersburg. It's like in this country, the poor, the criminal. They're taking people out of prisons. The shafted are fighting. And the rebuilding of Ukraine, there's a reconstruction conference in Berlin in early June. The World Bank estimates $1 trillion needed to rebuild Ukraine. And I don't think this country has a great example of leaving a country and coming back to help rebuild it. Now, they should take some of the money from Russian oligarchs. But they don't want to because it'll set a precedent.
Okay.
Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your great talk, Katrina, and all the great things you're doing. I'm just a little frustrated, like a lot of us are, lots of times, I think, where it seems like our country's becoming more materialistic. People who favor that approach seem to be gaining more power, and it seems maybe sometimes the public's becoming more apathetic and don't even seem to care generally about issues that we get excited about. So do you have any great ideas on how we can change that? Reverse that?
Yeah, solve these problems.
I think I think you could have, in the 1960s, which is reputed to be, this grand uprising of certain ways, it was still a minority. You want to engage, it seems to me you want to normalize our ideas, build out our ideas so that more are engaged. You need to meet people where they are. There's a reason. Things change, though. When change comes, it tips, right? Movements arise, and they grow, and then they become part of the culture in ways. I don't buy that this is, sure, there's social media, everything moves more quickly. There have been oligarchs, there have been, railroad industries. Things seem dire, and they are in many ways, but I do think people are resilient. And you know, you have the king, we can talk about king, right? We were talking about, I mean, I used to talk to my father who had been involved in public life. What was 68 like? You know, 2 assassinations, political bombings, a sense of a country out of control, Vietnam. I mean, you know, so I think to put it in perspective is important, and to know history. I work with a lot of great interns, and they say, well, I wasn't alive then. Well, I wasn't alive like in 1950. I mean, so I think it's important to have a framework, a perspective, a context, and not be distant from your own times. But.
No, David, I think, was next. Can we get the mic over to David? There we go.
Vladimir Putin has said regarding nuclear war, and I believe this is an accurate translation. He said about nuclear war, he said it would be devastating for the entire world, but then I say to myself, as the president of the Russian state, why do we need a world without Russia? Okay. Now these are the words of a madman. Now it can be a good political tactic to make people think you're a madman. There's no telling. But do you think he's a madman?
No. I think he's tyrannical. I think he's tyrannical. His first instinct may be use of force. What he did in Chechnya was, you could see some of what's happened in Ukraine, the barbarity in the raising of Chechnya. I think he's someone who came into power and he looked at a country that was on its knees, nuclear reactors unguarded, and he has outlived his welcome. I mean, he's kind of dealt with the trauma of a country that imploded in 1917 and then in 1991. His 2 daughters spoke at this conference the other day, which was interesting because he never really shows his family. They're both, I think, scientists. I mean, he's not Stalin. I mean, my husband wrote a biography of Nikolai Bukharin, who was killed in the purges. You know, there are debates about the numbers. Stalin, I think, was a man of the Gulag, but he was also a man of the state. He built the state. He industrialized a Russia that survived World War II. Putin's a statist, and I fear rational in the context of Russia. And I'm not saying this to apologize, but there are worse, quote, worse meaning more hawkish, more nationalist, and the figures in Donbass, sadly, have, you know, been pushing hawkish. So, but you know, you can't study Russia today, I've always felt this, without studying the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, it's become a country that has moved in its tradition from westernizing to Slavophile, which is part of the Russian tradition. He's moving east now. In fact, you could argue that the world configuration eastward is going to be an important frame, and the global south. Brzezinski would have a fit because I think his nightmare was that Russia and China would be an alliance. I don't think it's a full, real alliance. It's transactional, but it's happening.
Okay, I think number 7 was who? There, Alan, and then we'll get you, and then we'll wrap it up soon after that.
Hi, thanks very much for your talk. My name's Alan Roebuck. I'm a professor at Rutgers. I've been working on, I'm a climate scientist. I participated in a Soviet-American exchange on protection of the natural environment. I went there 6 times, and we worked with Russian scientists, and it was great. We together did a lot of good work. But now, as you said, a lot of these connections are broken. We're still in the space station with the Russians, but that's just a couple people. And so I was wondering, on the one hand, we have succeeded. There hasn't been a nuclear war in almost 79 years. On the other hand, the chance of it is really high, and it just takes a mistake or a broken machine or a crazy leader. We need new leaders, as you said, new young leaders. So I was wondering what you think of the prospect of Joe Biden just before the Democratic convention saying, "Oh, I don't feel very good. I don't want to be president."
I thought this was a serious question. I'm sorry.
And who could come to replace him? Would it be Gretchen Whitmer, or is there any chance of that?
I was struck by Biden wanting to replicate Reagan and sounding older than he is in the kind of framework he. We need new leaders. I'm not sure younger leaders. I'm serious. There are some wise older people. It is scary, though, I think, because this is, he'll be 86, I think, at the end of his presidency if he's elected. Right. I think we have to take what's on offer right now and build toward 2028, but build the Senate, the House, the work you're doing. Don't forget that. I mean, there's a reason my sister's not in politics, but what's going on in Congress? Why can't they do anything? Well, Johnson and FDR had big margins for a while in the Senate and the House. Now, I'm not going to talk about the court. But I do think the dialogue is important, and you could play a role. If representatives were willing to say, nurse exchange, librarian exchange. Now, librarians are already under a lot of stress and problems, maybe not nurses. But there are all kinds of exchange that would begin a process. And maybe it's involving a third country, but just to open it up a little.
Yeah, a lot of the scientists left when the Soviet Union fell because they saw that they could work better in Europe or in North America.
Absolutely, and there's been an outflow from Russia, huge. To Berlin, to Europe, not necessarily here. But that's also to be, you want scientists living inside and doing the work for a country, which has had such great achievements. But
my wife was at that 82 walk also. Is there any prospect of organizing people and getting nuclear war much higher up on their list of concerns without somebody
an accident?
using one?
I think it's coming, every day there's something about nuclear threat, nuclear peril, nuclear war. That's a good question that's a good question how to kind of solidify it into something that is kind of a national event. Think about this, these debates. We used to do 10 questions that should be asked. I think it's worthwhile trying to get a campaign. The debate is June 27th. That there was no, can you imagine the last debate? There were no questions about COVID. But a question about nuclear peril, and not just, you can add this if you wish, but Putin's a criminal. Like the history and where we are today and the danger. And someone who wrote a really extraordinary book, Marty Sherwin and Kai Bird wrote Oppenheimer, but Marty's book on the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of the best. And he talks about, it's not just Cuban Missile Crisis, but fate averted some of these nuclear accidents.
Let me just mention one other book. It's called Nuclear War by Annie Jacobson.
Yeah, no, that's going
Nuclear
I know
War
you did a
Scenario.
webinar.
Everybody should read it if you haven't, because that's how it could happen.
This becomes a tipping point because that's received quite a bit of attention. And the New York Times, though it didn't acknowledge abolition, did a spread about a month ago for the first time. So I think to keep that on the agenda of attention is important.
Yes, and Elliot's going to have the next question. While you're bringing it up, let me just mention that I think that New York Times series was important.
It was.
It was thorough, it was deep, it was factual, and I think we need to keep coming back to bringing it to the forefront. So I don't think this is a lost cause. I think we can reactivate our nuclear disarmament movement.
You should ask for meetings with the New York Times editorial board, the Washington, just in the region, in Philadelphia, in New Jersey. Seriously.
Good. Elliot.
Just a comment, as we've had this conference going on today, I just quickly on my iPhone listened to saw President Macron just dissolve the French Parliament because of the fact that Marine Le Pen's party has trounced them. And so there are going to be new elections in France. And the idea that there's the Le Pen party that can do this, unbelievable.
But I don't know, because these are the EU elections. Why would it lead to a I'm sorry, they're the European Union elections. I'm not clear why it led to the dissolution of the French.
Because of the fact that Le Pen got all these monstrous amount of votes.
Okay.
So they're going to have a new election in France. So that's something.
But you know, one has to also understand, I mean, not condone, but why is Le Pen's party, why is the right doing as it's doing?
Why
You know, I mean, there's a sense, some of it is the fear of climate change, some of it's the fear of, the fear of working to fight climate change, like remember the yellow vests? And then you had the farmers. It's complicated. It's immigration. It's very frightening. And Le Pen is not even the most right in her party.
One final question.
This is quick comment question kind of thing. With the media. So, you know, when you peruse the internet, as we all do, and social media and all this stuff, and there's all this stuff on there that's kind of like, it doesn't make sense or it's scary. So, you know, there's articles, the 10 best cheesesteaks in Philadelphia. There's articles, how to survive a nuclear war. What is going on with all those articles about how to survive a nuclear war? Right there, and, you know, is there, what's going on with that? What is that?
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Well, first of all, the idea that you have those, it's kind of the debasement of our culture, too, that I've always watched cable, and then you see on the bottom, the chyron, the caption is like, George Carlin, you remember George Carlin? He had like, nuclear war after the sports. So there's like a leveling that one is equivalent to the other. You know, there's a lot of algorithmic craziness. If you've put in something about your concern or fight against nuclear weapons, you may be getting this kind of how to live through. And there are people, anyway, I just want to say, I do like Rachel Maddow, but there was a survey that she spent 74% of her time on Russiagate for about 4 years because people equated Putin with Trump and Trump with Putin. And my Russian journalist friends were horrified that such infallibility was given to Putin, that he could put the American president in office. And I do think we wasted quite a bit of time not looking at our own pathologies that led to the election of Trump, and to blame others is easier. It's like conspiracies are easier than complexity.
Let's show our appreciation to Katrina.
Thank you.